At 03:45 hours on the morning of December 24th, 1944, Obergefreiter Klaus Richter stood in a snow-covered foxhole near the Belgian town of Bastogne, watching tracer fire arc across the night sky. He was 19 years old, a veteran of 6 months on the Eastern Front, now reassigned to the Ardennes offensive that High Command promised would split the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war. Richter had learned to read artillery fire the way a sailor reads the sea. The whistle of incoming shells told him trajectory and distance. The sound of the explosion told him the caliber. The pattern of impacts told him whether to stay in his foxhole or move to deeper cover. He had survived Kursk. He had survived the retreat through Ukraine. He understood that artillery was dangerous, but survivable if you knew what you were doing. What he did not know, could not know, was that the rules had changed. American artillery batteries surrounding Bastogne had just received shipments of a new type of shell marked with red bands and the codename POSIT. These shells carried a proximity fuse that would detonate automatically when it sensed a target nearby, and the warning time between detection and detonation was 11 seconds. 11 seconds. That was how long a German soldier had from the moment a proximity fused shell detected him until the explosion killed him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Not 11 seconds from when he heard the whistle, not 11 seconds from when he saw the muzzle flash, 11 seconds from the moment the shell's miniature radar locked onto his body heat and mass, while the shell was still hundreds of meters away, invisible in the darkness, traveling at 700 meters per second. 11 seconds to realize something was wrong. 11 seconds to understand that the artillery shell screaming toward your position was not going to explode on impact with the ground. 11 seconds to comprehend that your foxhole, your trench, your carefully prepared defensive position was not going to protect you. 11 seconds to make peace with the fact that you were already dead and just didn't know it yet. This is the story of what happened during those 11 seconds, what German soldiers experienced, what they understood, what they never learned, and why the proximity fuse represented not just a technological advantage, but a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare that turned defensive positions into death traps and made survival a matter of pure chance rather than tactical skill. The mathematics of artillery survival had been understood since the First World War, when a conventional high-explosive shell detonated on impact with the ground. The blast created a hemisphere of lethal fragmentation. Shrapnel traveled outward and upward at high velocity, but most of the energy was directed into the ground. A soldier in a foxhole 3 feet deep was protected from everything except a direct hit within a few meters of his position. The statistics supported this understanding. During the First World War, artillery caused approximately 70% of all casualties, but most soldiers killed by artillery were caught in the open or in shallow cover. Troops in properly constructed trenches with overhead protection could survive even heavy bombardment. The German army had spent 4 years perfecting trench warfare tactics based on this fundamental principle. By 1944, German defensive doctrine emphasized deep foxholes with overhead cover, log-reinforced bunkers, and communication trenches that allowed troops to move between positions without exposure. These positions were designed to survive Allied artillery bombardment. Engineers calculated blast effects. They specified minimum depths. They trained soldiers on proper construction techniques. The system worked because the physics were predictable. A 105mm artillery shell exploding on the ground created a lethal radius of approximately 20 meters. Fragments lost energy rapidly due to air resistance. Beyond 30 meters, the probability of serious injury dropped significantly. Beyond 50 meters, most fragments lacked sufficient energy to penetrate clothing and equipment. A soldier in a properly constructed foxhole 50 meters from an impact point was statistically safe. The proximity fuse shattered those calculations. Instead of detonating on impact, proximity fused shells exploded 30 to 50 feet above the ground, directly over defensive positions. The blast created a cone of fragmentation that traveled downward with maximum energy. Foxholes offered no protection. Trenches became killing zones. log-reinforced bunkers were penetrated by fragments traveling at supersonic velocity. The lethal radius increased by a factor of 3. More critically, the predictability was gone. With conventional artillery, soldiers could estimate where shells would land. Based on the sound of incoming fire and the pattern of previous impacts, they could move to safer positions between salvos. They could time their movements to minimize exposure. Proximity, fused shells eliminated that tactical awareness because the explosion came from above with no warning and no pattern to read. The 11-second window began when the proximity fuse activated. Inside the nose of each shell was a miniature radio transmitter operating at 455 megahertz. When the shell left the gun barrel, centrifugal force from the rifling grooves closed a mercury switch that activated a reserve battery. The battery powered up the transmitter and receiver circuits. This took approximately 0.3 of a second. During that initialization period, the fuse was inert. This was a critical safety feature. If the fuse activated immediately upon firing, it might detect the gun crew or nearby structures and detonate prematurely, killing friendly forces. The 0.3 of a second delay ensured the shell traveled at least 750 feet from the gun before the fuse could function. Once active, the transmitter began emitting continuous radio waves in all directions. These waves traveled at the speed of light, reflecting off any object they encountered. When the reflected signals returned to the shell, the receiver circuit measured their strength. As the shell approached a target, the reflected signal strength increased exponentially. When the signal strength exceeded a predetermined threshold, an electronic relay triggered the detonator. The threshold was calibrated to detonate the shell at optimal altitude above the target. For anti-aircraft use, this was approximately 70 feet. For ground targets, it was 30 to 40 feet. The calibration was performed during manufacturing using test equipment that simulated different target ranges and altitudes. Each fuse was individually tested before being installed in a shell. The detection range of the proximity fuse was classified information, but engineering specifications indicated the fuse could sense large targets at distances up to 300 meters. For ground targets, like concentrated infantry, detection typically occurred at 100 to 150 meters, depending on terrain and the number of soldiers in the target area. Large metal objects, like tanks or vehicles, could be detected at greater ranges. At typical artillery velocities of 700 meters per second, 150 meters translated to 0.214 seconds, roughly 1/5 of a second from detection to detonation. But that calculation only accounted for the time the shell was in flight after detection. It did not account for the distance the shell traveled before detection or the cognitive processing time required for soldiers to understand they were under attack. The actual 11-second window was more complex. It began not when the fuse detected the target, but when the shell left the gun barrel. That was the moment when German soldiers on the receiving end had any possibility of survival through evasive action. But they did not know the shell had been fired. They did not know it was traveling toward them. They did not know they needed to take evasive action. The sound of the gun firing traveled at approximately 340 meters per second. The speed of sound. If the artillery battery was 10 kilometers away, which was typical for 105mm guns, the sound would take 29 seconds to reach German positions, but the shell, traveling at 700 meters per second, would arrive in 14 seconds. The soldiers would hear the gun firing 15 seconds after the shell had already exploded. This created an impossible tactical situation. Unlike conventional artillery, where the sound of firing gave soldiers several seconds to take cover before impact, proximity, fused artillery arrived before soldiers knew they were under attack. The first indication was the explosion itself, 30 feet above their heads, showering their positions with supersonic steel fragments. Even if soldiers somehow detected the incoming shell, perhaps by the faint whistle it made, cutting through the air, they had no effective response. Conventional doctrine said to get low and stay in your foxhole. That was the worst possible action, with proximity-fused shells. The explosion came from above. The foxhole concentrated fragments. Soldiers who followed their training died. The alternative was to abandon cover and run. But where? The shell was traveling at 700 meters per second. A running soldier could cover perhaps 7 meters per second. The shell could adjust its detonation point based on target location. Running toward or away from the shell made no difference. Running laterally might help if the soldier happened to choose the correct direction, and if the shell's lethal radius was small enough, and if he had enough time to get outside that radius before detonation. In practice, none of those conditions were met. The soldier did not know which direction the shell was coming from. The lethal radius was large enough that he could not escape it in the available time. And he did not have enough time because he did not know he needed to run until he heard the explosion that killed him. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter learned this on the morning of December 24th, 1944. American artillery batteries began firing at 0350 hours. Richter heard the distant rumble of guns and instinctively pressed himself into the bottom of his foxhole. Standard procedure: wait for the impacts, assess the pattern, adjust position if necessary between salvos. The first salvo landed 200 meters to his left. He heard the explosions, felt the ground shake, but was not concerned. The barrage was not targeted at his section. He remained in his foxhole, waiting for the firing to stop so he could resume watch. The second salvo landed 100 meters closer. Still, not a direct threat, but moving in his direction. He considered moving to a deeper bunker 30 meters behind his position, but decided to wait. The third salvo changed everything. Richter heard a sound he had never heard before. Not the whistle of falling shells, but a sharp crackling noise directly overhead. Then the world exploded. The blast wave hit him from above with crushing force. His ears rang, his vision blurred. He tasted blood and dirt. He tried to move, but his body would not respond. What Richter experienced in that moment was the result of a shell detonating 35 feet above his foxhole. The explosion occurred 0.2 seconds after the proximity fuse detected him and the 11 soldiers in the foxholes around him. During those 0.2 seconds, the shell traveled 140 meters, dropping from an altitude of approximately 500 feet to the optimal detonation height. The detonator fired the high explosive charge containing 1.47 kilograms of composition B, converted from solid to gas in less than 1/10,000th of a second. The shell's ink casing fragmented into approximately 1,500 pieces, ranging in size from dust particles to chunks of steel weighing several ounces. These fragments traveled outward at initial velocities exceeding 1,500 meters per second. Because the explosion occurred in the air, the fragments formed a roughly spherical pattern, not the hemispherical pattern created by ground bursts. The fragments, traveling downward, maintained maximum energy because they had not encountered any obstacles. They struck the ground, and everything on it, with enough force to penetrate 3 inches of pine wood or 1 inch of steel plate at 50 meters range. Richter was hit by 7 fragments. 3 struck his helmet, denting it severely, but not penetrating. 2 hit his left shoulder, tearing through his wool coat and field jacket, but embedding in the leather equipment straps he wore. 1 fragment entered his right thigh, severing the femoral artery. The final fragment struck him in the lower back, fracturing 2 vertebrae and puncturing his right kidney. He did not die immediately. The fragment that struck his femoral artery caused rapid blood loss, but the cold temperature constricted his blood vessels, slowing the bleeding. He remained conscious for approximately 4 minutes, long enough to hear the screams of the other soldiers in his section who had also been hit, long enough to understand that something was fundamentally different about this barrage, long enough to realize he was going to die without ever understanding what had killed him. 2 soldiers in the foxholes nearest to Richter were killed instantly. 3 others were seriously wounded. The remaining 6 survived with minor injuries, protected by the random distribution of fragments and the fact that they happened to be in positions slightly offset from the optimal burst height. Artillery is never perfectly lethal. Even proximity-fused shells created patterns of survival and death that appeared random to the soldiers experiencing them. But from the perspective of American artillery officers observing the results, the effectiveness was undeniable. A conventional barrage of 6 shells might have wounded 2 or 3 soldiers, primarily from concussion and flying debris. The proximity-fused barrage of 6 shells killed or seriously wounded 8 soldiers out of 12, a casualty rate of 67%. And this was achieved without direct hits, without precise targeting, without visual observation of the target area. The tactical implications were staggering. German defensive positions that would have required sustained bombardment with conventional artillery could be neutralized with a fraction of the ammunition. Troops in foxholes were as vulnerable as troops in the open. The advantage of prepared defensive positions had been eliminated, and, most critically, German soldiers had no counter-tactics because they did not understand what was happening. Prisoners of war captured during the Battle of the Bulge repeatedly described proximity-fused artillery as the most demoralizing weapon they had faced. They used phrases like shells that exploded in the air with no warning and explosions that came from above, not from the ground. Many reported that after experiencing proximity-fused barrages, their units refused to leave bunkers, even when ordered to advance or reinforce other positions. One German sergeant, captured on December 27th near Bastogne, told his interrogators that his platoon had been subjected to 3 proximity-fused barrages over a 24-hour period. After the 3rd barrage, 5 soldiers deserted. 4 others claimed to be too shell-shocked to fight. The remaining soldiers would only move between positions during darkness and only in small groups with maximum dispersion to reduce the effectiveness of airburst weapons. The sergeant said he had served on the Eastern Front for 2 years. He had survived Stalingrad. He had fought through the retreat from Ukraine. He considered himself a hardened combat veteran who understood the risks of warfare, but proximity-fused artillery was different. It felt personal. It felt targeted. It felt like the shells were hunting individual soldiers, not just bombarding an area. His description was more accurate than he realized. The proximity fuse did hunt individual soldiers. The radar transmitter emitted radio waves that reflected off human bodies. The receiver detected those reflections and calculated optimal detonation point. In a very literal sense, the shell was tracking its targets and adjusting its behavior to maximize lethality. This represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between weapons and targets. Throughout military history, weapons had been inert objects whose behavior was determined entirely by the operator. An archer aimed an arrow, a gunner aimed a cannon. The weapon traveled to its target following simple ballistic physics. If the operator calculated trajectory correctly, the weapon hit the target. If not, it missed. Proximity-fused shells introduced a different paradigm. The operator aimed generally at a target area, but the weapon itself determined the precise moment of detonation based on sensor input. The weapon was making tactical decisions. It was responding to the environment. It was, in a primitive sense, autonomous. German soldiers instinctively recognized this difference. Their descriptions of proximity-fused artillery emphasized the feeling of being targeted, being tracked, being hunted by weapons that seemed to know where they were. These descriptions appear throughout interrogation reports, after-action summaries, and personal accounts written after the war. This psychological impact was as significant as the physical casualties. Military effectiveness depends on soldiers' willingness to remain in dangerous positions and execute orders despite personal risk. That willingness is sustained by soldiers' belief that they can control their survival through tactical skill, that their training and experience give them an edge, that they understand the threats they face and know how to counter them. Proximity-fused artillery undermined that belief system. Soldiers who survived multiple barrages could not identify any pattern that explained why they survived while others died. The randomness was complete. Veteran soldiers with years of combat experience died in the same barrages that left inexperienced replacements unharmed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Tactical positioning made no difference. Following doctrine made no difference. Survival appeared to be pure chance. That realization destroyed unit cohesion. If survival was random, if tactical skill made no difference, if training and experience provided no advantage, then why follow orders? Why maintain position? Why not desert or surrender, or simply refuse to fight? German commanders struggled with these questions throughout the final 6 months of the war as proximity-fused artillery became standard across Allied forces. The 11-second window was really a psychological window. The time between when a soldier realized something new and terrifying was happening and when he died without understanding what it was. That cognitive gap, that moment of confusion and fear and recognition that all his training was useless, was the true weapon. The steel fragments were just the delivery mechanism. American artillery officers understood this, even if they did not articulate it in psychological terms. After-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge emphasized that proximity-fused shells were most effective when used in concentrated barrages against defensive positions where German troops felt relatively safe. The reports noted that single shells had limited impact because survivors attributed their survival to luck. But sustained barrages created cumulative psychological effects that degraded combat effectiveness far beyond the actual casualty rates. One American colonel, commanding an artillery battalion near Bastogne, wrote in his report that proximity-fused shells should be employed to create maximum uncertainty rather than maximum casualties. Fire 3 to 5 rounds at a position, then wait 20 minutes, then fire again. The waiting period allowed survivors to emerge from cover and attempt to reorganize. The second barrage caught them in the open and reinforced the perception that proximity-fused shells could find them anywhere. This represented sophisticated psychological warfare delivered through artillery technology. The goal was not just to kill German soldiers, but to make them fear and distrust their defensive positions to the point where they became ineffective combatants. The 11-second window was being weaponized not just as a tactical advantage, but as a tool of psychological destruction. German military intelligence eventually identified proximity-fused shells and issued warnings to frontline units. By mid-January 1945, most German officers understood that American artillery was using shells with radar fuses that detonated in the air above targets. The intelligence summaries described the general operating principles and advised soldiers to maximize dispersion and avoid concentrating in fixed defensive positions. But that advice was tactically impossible to implement. German forces in the West were conducting defensive operations against numerically superior Allied armies. Defense required holding prepared positions. It required concentrating forces at key points. It required soldiers to remain in foxholes and trenches, even under artillery fire, because abandoning positions meant losing ground that could not be retaken. The proximity fuse had created a tactical paradox. The only effective countermeasure was to abandon defensive positions and maximize dispersion, but that meant surrendering territory and giving up any coherent defensive strategy. German commanders were forced to choose between accepting high casualties from proximity-fused artillery or accepting territorial losses from inadequate defense. Either choice led to defeat. Some units attempted to adapt by constructing deeper bunkers with substantial overhead cover. Engineering guidelines specified that bunkers needed at least 3 feet of log and earth cover to protect against proximity-fused shells detonating overhead, but construction of such bunkers required time, materials, and labor that German forces did not have. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht was in constant retreat. There was no time to build elaborate fortifications. Other units tried dispersing forces more widely to reduce casualties from individual proximity-fused shells, but wider dispersion meant thinner defensive lines that could be more easily penetrated by Allied infantry, and wider dispersion made it harder for German commanders to coordinate defensive actions or mass forces for counterattacks. The tactical advantages of proximity fused artillery extended beyond the direct casualties it caused. The most detailed German analysis of proximity-fused artillery effectiveness came from interrogations of Oberst Hans Schulz, captured in March 1945 near Remagen. Schulz had commanded an infantry regiment during the Battle of the Bulge and the subsequent defensive operations in the Rhineland. His unit had been subjected to proximity-fused artillery bombardment on more than 30 separate occasions over a 3-month period. Schulz provided a methodical assessment of proximity-fuse impacts on his unit's combat effectiveness. He estimated that proximity-fused shells caused approximately 3 times as many casualties per shell as conventional artillery. But the indirect effects were even more significant. His soldiers became increasingly reluctant to leave fortified positions even when ordered to advance or counterattack. Desertion rates increased by 40%. Combat efficiency ratings declined by more than half. Most significantly, Schulz noted that his unit's ability to conduct nighttime operations was severely compromised. German forces had relied on darkness to provide cover for movement and repositioning, but proximity-fused shells were equally effective at night. American artillery could fire on suspected German positions without visual observation, knowing that the proximity fuses would automatically detonate at optimal height, regardless of visibility conditions. This eliminated one of the few remaining tactical advantages German forces possessed. During darkness, Allied air superiority was less effective. Allied armor was less mobile. Allied infantry was more cautious. German units could move, reposition, conduct limited counterattacks, but proximity-fused artillery negated those opportunities. American gunners simply fired time-on-target barrages at likely German positions. The shells found their targets automatically. Schulz described one night operation where his battalion attempted to withdraw from an exposed salient to more defensible positions 5 kilometers to the rear. The movement was conducted at night to minimize exposure to Allied observation. But American artillery detected the movement, possibly through sound ranging or radar, and fired proximity-fused shells at the roads and trails his troops were using. The barrage caused 73 casualties in 15 minutes. The battalion broke into small groups that scattered into the surrounding forests. It took 2 days to reassemble the unit. More than 100 soldiers never returned, either killed, wounded, or deserted. The battalion was combat ineffective for a week, all from a single artillery barrage that Schulz estimated consisted of fewer than 200 shells. He compared this to conventional artillery barrages his unit had experienced earlier in the war. A barrage of 200 conventional shells might cause 10 to 15 casualties if soldiers were in prepared positions. It might disrupt operations for an hour or two while units reorganized. But it rarely caused the kind of systemic breakdown he experienced from proximity-fused barrages. The difference, Schulz argued, was predictability. Conventional artillery followed patterns. Shells landed in a sequence that skilled soldiers could read and respond to. They could estimate where the next shells would land. They could move between impacts. They could time their actions to minimize exposure. Proximity-fused shells eliminated all those tactical responses. Schulz's assessment was remarkably objective for an officer describing weapons that had destroyed his unit. He acknowledged that proximity-fused shells represented a genuine technological breakthrough, not just an incremental improvement in artillery effectiveness. He predicted that future defensive operations would require fundamentally different tactics because the basic assumption that soldiers in cover were protected from artillery fire was no longer valid. His prediction proved accurate. Post-war military doctrine in both the United States and Soviet Union emphasized mobility and dispersion specifically to counter proximity-fused artillery and similar weapons. The massed infantry formations that had been standard in World War II were replaced by smaller, more dispersed units that moved constantly to avoid presenting concentrated targets for proximity-fused weapons. But German forces in early 1945 did not have the luxury of developing new doctrine. They were fighting a losing war with diminishing resources against enemies who possessed overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. The proximity fuse was just one of many advantages Allied forces enjoyed, but it was an advantage that affected every soldier in every defensive position every day. The psychological toll was cumulative and irreversible. Each proximity fused barrage reinforced the perception that German soldiers were helpless, that their defensive positions were death traps, that survival was random chance rather than tactical skill. Unit cohesion deteriorated, combat effectiveness declined, surrender rates increased, the will to fight evaporated. This was the strategic impact of the 11-second window, not the 11 seconds from detection to detonation, but the weeks and months during which German soldiers gradually realized they were fighting against weapons they could not counter with weapons that made their training and experience irrelevant, with weapons that killed randomly and efficiently and without warning. By April 1945, German forces in the West were collapsing. Some units surrendered without firing a shot, others disintegrated as soldiers deserted en masse. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe just 4 years earlier, ceased to exist as a coherent military force. Proximity-fused artillery was not the sole cause of that collapse, but it was a significant contributing factor. The irony was that German scientists had explored proximity-fused technology extensively before the war. Research institutes in Berlin and Munich had investigated radio fuses, acoustic fuses, and photoelectric fuses. They understood the theoretical principles, they recognized the potential military applications, but they concluded that the engineering challenges were insurmountable. Specifically, German engineers believed that vacuum tubes could not survive the acceleration forces of artillery gun firing. Test after test showed tubes shattering under forces exceeding 10,000 times gravity. The rifling grooves in gun barrels created rotational forces of 25,000 revolutions per minute that destroyed any electronic components. The problem appeared insoluble. American engineers solved it by developing ruggedized vacuum tubes based on hearing aid technology, miniaturizing components to reduce mass, and redesigning circuits to operate under extreme vibration and acceleration. The solutions were not conceptually sophisticated. They were engineering persistence, iterative testing, and willingness to attempt what conventional engineering wisdom said was impossible. The Germans never attempted that approach because their engineering culture valued theoretical elegance over empirical trial and error. German scientists were trained to solve problems through mathematical analysis and theoretical understanding. American engineers were trained to solve problems by building prototypes and testing them until they worked. Both approaches had merits, but in this case, the American approach produced working proximity fuses, while German theoretical analysis concluded the technology was impossible. This pattern repeated throughout the war across multiple technologies. German scientists developed jet engines, rocket weapons, and early computers based on brilliant theoretical work, but they often struggled to transition those theories into reliable, mass-produced weapons systems. American industry excelled at taking existing concepts and scaling them to mass production with relentless focus on reliability and manufacturability. The proximity fuse exemplified this difference. The concept was well understood. Multiple nations had explored it, but only the United States produced proximity fuses in quantities of millions with reliability sufficient for combat use and cost low enough for wide deployment. By 1945, American factories were producing more than 100,000 proximity fuses per week. German industry could not match that output even for conventional artillery shells. The soldiers who died in those 11 seconds between detection and detonation never knew any of this context. They did not know they were victims of American industrial capacity. They did not know their deaths resulted from engineering decisions made in laboratories thousands of miles away. They did not know that their own scientists had explored the same technology and abandoned it as impractical. All they knew was that artillery shells were exploding above them with perfect timing, that their foxholes offered no protection, that their training was useless, that survival was impossible to predict or control. They died, confused, terrified, unable to understand what was killing them or how to defend against it. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter bled to death in his foxhole at approximately 0355 hours on December 24th, 1944. He was one of approximately 2,000 German soldiers killed by proximity-fused artillery during the Battle of the Bulge. His body was recovered 3 days later when American forces recaptured the area. He was buried in a mass grave with 17 other German soldiers, then, later, reinterred at the German military cemetery at Lommel in Belgium. His grave marker lists his name, rank, unit, and date of death. It does not mention proximity-fused artillery or radar technology or the 11-second window between detection and detonation. It does not explain that he died as a victim of technological warfare, killed by a weapon his army could not counter and could barely understand. The proximity fuse remained classified until after the war ended. German military intelligence never fully grasped its capabilities or its impact. Post-war analyses by German officers generally attributed their defeat to numerical superiority and overwhelming material resources, which was true, but incomplete. They rarely mentioned specific weapon systems like the proximity fuse because they had never fully understood them. American military historians recognized the proximity fuse's significance immediately after the war. Studies concluded it was one of the 3 most important technologies of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. It saved thousands of Allied lives by making anti-aircraft defenses effective against kamikaze attacks. It multiplied artillery effectiveness by a factor of 3 to 5. It contributed to the collapse of German resistance in the final months of the war. But the proximity fuse never captured public imagination the way radar or the atomic bomb did. It was too technical, too obscure, too difficult to explain to non-specialists. There were no dramatic photographs of proximity-fused shells, no spectacular demonstrations of their power, just statistical analyses showing casualty rates and effectiveness ratios that meant little to general audiences. The soldiers who experienced proximity-fused artillery understood its significance viscerally, but most never spoke about it after the war. German veterans rarely discussed their defeats in detail. American veterans rarely discussed artillery technology specifically. The proximity fuse faded into obscurity, known to military specialists but forgotten by the broader public. Yet it represented a fundamental transformation in warfare. For thousands of years, defensive positions had protected soldiers from projectile weapons. Walls, trenches, fortifications, all were built on the principle that solid obstacles between the weapon and the soldier provided protection. The proximity fuse demonstrated that protection was an illusion. If a weapon could detonate above the defensive position, if it could rain shrapnel down from above, then no static defense was safe. Modern military doctrine reflects this reality. Armed forces emphasize mobility over fortification, dispersion over concentration, constant movement over static defense. These tactical principles emerged directly from lessons learned with proximity-fused artillery and similar weapons. The 11-second window between detection and detonation became the model for how modern guided weapons operate, tracking targets autonomously and detonating at optimal moments without human intervention. The soldiers who died in those 11 seconds were among the first casualties of autonomous weapons warfare. They did not face an operator making deliberate targeting decisions. They faced a mechanical system that detected their presence and executed its programming without human oversight. The decision to kill them was made by a circuit in the nose of an artillery shell, responding to reflected radio waves, calculating optimal detonation altitude, firing the detonator. That transformation from human-controlled to machine-controlled lethality defines modern warfare. Guided missiles, smart bombs, autonomous drones all operate on the same fundamental principle pioneered by the proximity fuse. Sensors detect targets, Processors calculate optimal engagement parameters. Weapons execute without requiring human decision-making in the final moments before detonation. German soldiers in 1944 experienced this transformation without understanding it. They knew something had changed. They knew artillery had become impossibly effective. They knew their defensive positions no longer protected them. But they could not articulate what had happened in terms we now use to describe autonomous weapon systems. The 11 seconds between detection and detonation was the birth of a new kind of warfare. A warfare where soldiers faced weapons that hunted them, tracked them, and killed them through electronic decision-making rather than human targeting. The soldiers who died in those 11 seconds were the first casualties of that transformation. They would not be the last. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.